Good afternoon, everyone, and thank you for joining us for this Women Empowering Defence session this afternoon on identifying and rectifying toxic leadership. I have started the recording, so please do keep your cameras off unless you're speaking, but please do use the chat function or the raise hand throughout, and I'm sure the team will be more than happy to answer any questions that you may have. It's our pleasure to welcome the panel today, and especially Danny Cairns, who is the panel chair for this afternoon's session. I came across Danny when he posted on Twitter his 30 by 30, and one was to do a TEDx talk, which I jumped on straight away, and here he is now. So without further ado, so we can get going, Danny, I'm going to hand over to you. Thanks so much.
Thank you, Natalie, and good afternoon, everybody, and welcome to today's panel on identifying and rectifying toxic leadership. I'm Danny Cairns, and I'll be your host today. We're all very fortunate to be joined by our four fantastic panel members, who I'll hand you over to in a short moment, and then we can start exploring the topic of toxic leadership. For our conversation today, we'll be using the following definition of toxic leadership as our baseline, which is toxic leadership is a combination of selfish attitudes, motivations, and behaviours that have an adverse effect on both subordinates and the organisation. And this has been quoted directly from the British Army's leadership doctrine. Today is going to be an informal affair. We're going to keep it conversational, yet respectful. So please, if you have something to add, just raise your hand and I'll get straight over to you. A quick story about myself. I've served in the Royal Navy now coming up to 8 years, and I've been very fortunate to have had a diverse career for someone of my seniority. That variation of roles has allowed me to witness a vast array of leadership styles, which in turn has allowed me to develop my own. In my current guise as a training manager and as the co-chair for the Royal Navy's LGBTQ+ network, I'm exposed to a wide variety of people at completely different stages of their career. Interacting with such diverse range of people from a whole host of sectors also means interacting with an equally diverse range of leadership environments, some of which could prove to be challenging or even toxic, and that's what we're here to explore today. Now, enough about me. It's time for our esteemed panelists to take to the stage. Each of them brings their own lived experience and their own individual outlook on tackling our questions. So in no particular order, Libby, can you start us off and introduce yourself, please?
Yeah, good afternoon. Hopefully you can hear me fine. Well, thank you very much for inviting me to be part of this panel. Super privileged to share it with the other panelists, of course. I'm Libby Valencefull. I'm currently a full-time specialist reservist mobilised, but not for too much longer. I conclude on my service in just a few weeks' time. I have approximately 30 years or 3 decades of work experience across oil and gas and defence. My background is I'm a geophysicist, and then moved into defence in the later part of my career as I sought a new challenge. I have come across many different styles of leadership. I've come across very interesting and exciting teams and been privileged to be exposed to cultures from all over the world. And I have, on the whole, had fantastic leadership. And that is why I think I can recognise toxic leadership and some of the traits of this and how we can counter that as individuals and make sure that we don't harness those behaviours and actually perpetuate those behaviours, but actually work out how to quell and quash them. So that's enough for me. I think, Danny, thank you very much, and super excited to be part of the panel today.
Thank you very much, Libby, and welcome to the panel. Next, we'll hand over to Adam, please.
Hi, Danny. Hi, everyone. Yeah, my name's Adam Versteeg. I'm the Chief People Officer at Janes. For those of you that don't know, Janes are a global business. We provide open source defence intelligence to organisations ranging from government agencies to military manufacturers. I have been in HR for some time. Obviously, I'm in a position where I am often the sort of I'm often someone that will, have to deal with these things directly. And I have earlier in my career, I started my career in the military as an infantry officer. So that's me. Nice to be here.
Great to have you, Adam. Thank you. Lynn, please, can you introduce yourself?
I can indeed. So afternoon, everyone. I'm Lynn Austin. I am the Director of International Facilities and UK Operations for General Dynamics Mission Systems. My role currently requires me to oversee around 300 colleagues across a number of different functional areas. I've spent only the last 6 years within defence. Previous to that, I spent around 20 years in financial services. So I have that variety of industry perspective that I can bring to the conversation today. Absolutely very similar to Libby. I've experienced wonderful and inspiring line management, but I've also experienced the converse, and as such I'm able to identify that. So really looking forward to the conversation today. Thanks, Danny.
Welcome, Lynn. Thank you very much. Last but not least, Tony, can you introduce yourself, please?
Yeah, hi Danny, hi everyone. Tony Simpson. My title is Justice Operations Director for a global French company called Sodexo. Large parts of our organisation have a long and proud relationship with the military, but I come from the slightly different side of things, which is I look after our prison business in the UK. We fully operate 7 prisons in the UK. I'm a prison governor to trade over 30 years now, both in the public sector and the private sector. And I think coming from an industry which you could say has gone through some cultural changes, command and control, and looking at that through both the commercial private angle and also the public sector angle, I think gives me a pretty helpful insight today to talk through some of those journeys and different insights that might bring. So pleasure to be here today. Thank you.
Perfect. Thank you very much, everybody. Shall we get started then? I think the most logical place to start here would be with the identification of toxic leadership itself, to which I'm going to start with Adam, if I may. Through your eyes, what are some of the key indicators or warning signs of toxic leadership that could be observed in the workplace?
Okay, well, I was thinking about this, and as a sort of opening point, I think it's really important to recognize this is ultimately about behaviors of someone, behaviors of a leader. And I also think it's when you think about toxic leadership, you quite often you might think, first of all, of the more extreme examples. You might think of a case of bullying or hostility within an organization. But actually, a lot of the things that we all deal with are things that can be fairly common and aren't necessarily indicators that an organization is broken. It could be things such as a lack of communication or transparency, a leader micromanaging their team, a culture where there's sort of, there tends to be blame, for example. How an organization deals with things when things go wrong says a lot about the organization and its leaders. So I just wanted to make that point. There's a sliding scale here, and I think actually we deal with some of these traits very quite often. I also think that some of these toxic traits don't necessarily stem from awful people that an organization needs to remove. They can actually stem from a group of people leaders who may lack confidence or experience, and they sort of gravitate towards some of these traits from time to time, and we need to bring them back on track. So it's not necessarily just the sort of horrific things that you might read about in the press, bullying, hostility. Some of the things that you'd see, obviously, I think things that I've seen in my career that can be very damaging are, this idea of lack of communication, lack of transparency, openness, that can have a really negative impact. And the things that I worry about when these things happen is, we in our business, we do a lot of measurement. And these things lead to loss of key talent. You'd see this coming through in your attrition. People decide to leave. You'd also see this in a team beginning to not perform. In terms of identifying all this, I think one of the other points I'd make is it's really important to be able to spend time with people. And I think one of the things that certainly I've experienced over the past few years is there's been less of that, right? So and I think that's been challenging for leaders. I think you need a set of leaders that are able to spend time with their people face to face. That's really important. And having people that understand the business and can build relationships. So those are some of the sort of introductory things that I was thinking about, but I'll kind of hand over to some of my other panel members.
Yeah, I'll come in just now. Thanks, Adam. Yeah, thanks for that. You've covered quite a lot of ground there, and and reflecting on this, I think you've made a good point, really, that this happens at all levels of the organisation, doesn't it? And it is on a spectrum, but it is one of those things that I think often hides in plain sight. And if you just take half a step back, it's easily recognisable. And I think one of the things that if toxic leadership exists, you will know about it by the justifications that people put in place for its tolerance. So in other words, well, he or she gets the job done, or it's all about results, or it's, I had to learn the hard way, so other people have got to learn the hard way. So, if you work on the basis that there are two prerequisites that have got to be in place, one is the organisational culture that permits this, and the other is a group of people who are either susceptible or supportive to that. You would see that coming through just in the language that you hear, the use of I, not we. People stealing the limelight for themselves. But I think that tolerance and that kind of really not being inquisitive about why you've got a feeling about something or why you're hearing these things is a key giveaway, and that there could be something more deeply rooted in your organisation.
Could I perhaps make the point, Tony, thank you. Could I make the point about values? And I'm sure anybody who has ever listened to me on Women in Power and Defence previously hears me going on about values all the time, because I think values is really, really important. I think as an individual, you have your own set of values, of course, everyone does, and those are very personal, but organisations have an identity which are based around a set of values. And I think it's really important when individuals go into organisations to understand the true values of that organisation. Because if you really interrogate organisations about their values, you start to unlock some of the key ways that they think about how they develop their teams and their team structures based on those values. And team structures, if you look at the diversification, and Danny, you were quite open about this right up front, right? About diversity of thought, gender, neurodiversity, age. It doesn't matter what that diversity looks like, but the values are set in the diversity that you see in organisations and the teams that they develop. If you have diversity of thinking and individuals, you are less likely to have some of those toxicities. So one of the key indicators to understanding whether it exists or not is looking at diversity and the diversity of team. If you have a leader who only builds a team in their reflection, and they all look like that person, they all feel like that person, that's because of those narcissistic behaviours that toxic leaders often demonstrate. If there's a spread portfolio of diversity and thinking, it means the values that are really put on that organisation's website or that institution's website really hold true, and you can see that coming through in the diversity of teams. So, as I always harp on about, values are super important for that reason. Thank you.
Just to build on your point there, Libby, I think that you're absolutely right. I think if an organisation lives and breathes values, it enables everyone to challenge that toxic behaviour and feel quite comfortable to do that, in the sense of that's not how we do things around here. And I think if everyone believes that, then that helps you to kind of challenge those behaviours that you see. From a senior leadership perspective, one of the things that I'm very conscious of is ensuring that open dialogue across the teams, across the structure, and ensuring through regular skip levels, I'm being curious and asking the right questions. And that enables me to determine how that team are feeling, how those individuals are performing, but but also any barriers or anything that is holding them back from performing to the best of their ability. And I think what I've seen in previous experience is through those conversations, I'm able to pick up on some key things that I can delve into a little bit more. But I think being curious, having that open communication is absolutely key in being able to identify early points that some toxicity may be spreading into a team from a leader.
Danny, sorry to interrupt. Lynn, I'm just looking at some of the comments that are coming through around diversity of thinking and values. It's really easy to look at accountability for values, and the reason and the way that you can see this in organisations is their performance. Those organisations which live and breathe their values and have that diversity of thought are higher performing. And I have to say, from the perspective of research and studies that have been undertaken, it's usually profitability of those organisations. Where they are demonstrating profitability, it usually holds that they are holding close to their values and have super diverse teams. Where that lack of toxicity and self-image is important, but the team is important and the values of the team is important. Sorry to interrupt, Lynn, and thank you for letting me talk again, Danny.
That's absolutely fine. Thank you so much, Libby. I want to build on 2 points there that came from the communications, but also the challenge. Now, for me, a key indicator of toxic leadership within a team is the inability for the team to speak out or to challenge the leader. It shows that there's almost a risk avoidance or a fear to upset the balance of the team. That inability for the team to speak up and say, actually, is this the right direction we should be heading in? Or is this a good use of time, resources, money? And I think that's a really key indicator, particularly in particular sectors where we make those decisions on a daily basis that can have quite big impacts. But for the team to feel almost like an inability to jump in and say, there's a better way of doing this, I think is a key highlight there of somebody's leadership style being a little bit more overpowering, and that word that was used earlier of narcissistic, of it's my way or the highway, which I think all of this draws us very nicely onto our next question, actually. Now, all of us are placed somewhere within a hierarchy in our own organizations. But Lynn, can you talk to us about how can we, as members of an organizational hierarchy, effectively identify toxic leadership before it even has a chance to impact the team?
So I think I just touched on this in my previous question. I think regular skip levels across the team to understand how individuals are performing, always reiterating an open door policy to anyone within the organisation and ensuring that you back that up, right, that you're available if someone reaches out to you. Careful review of colleague engagement results, alongside performance and deliverables across a team. Leadership sessions where we enable colleagues to ask questions, but also give their insights in terms of barriers or struggles that they may be facing. I think close partnership with the HR team. Sometimes the HR team hear of things perhaps a little bit quicker than others, so ensuring that they feel comfortable also to flag any concerns and have conversations about possibly additional support or additional training that individuals within leadership roles may require. And I think just generally being tuned in to those leaders that are representing your teams and ensuring that you're listening to what they're saying to you and yet asking the questions about the teams below them as well.
Yeah, I've come in on the back of that. Thank you, Lynn. I think you've stolen most of my thunder there. Thank you for that. Yeah, just to build on a couple of those points, and I think the key for me is it's not really rocket science, is it? It's if you're aware of the cues and the clues. That word curiosity and professional curiosity, I think, is really, really important, and not just waiting to see if it hits your radar, but actually, bouncing around your radar and changing the frequency, putting yourself in situations where people may or may not want to share something with you. being involved in the scenarios where some of those cues and clues may exhibit or manifest themselves. You know, whether it's sitting in on meetings or being at events, or just doing the old walking about thing and just being receptive. I think as well, one of the important things that you can do to flush it out, it's going to sound obviously, is not be it. So, actively model non-toxic behaviours in such a way that sends out the message, even non-verbally to people, that that's not the way business is done. That's not the way you do business, because that in and of itself may give people the confidence to say, well, hold on, perhaps this person, my manager, this person over here is actually out of kilter with the organisation, because I see positive behaviours across here, and that opens up, or that gives some courage or bravery to raise any issues that may want to be raised.
Yeah. If I could maybe add to that, actually, because that's a really good point. I think in terms of organisational hierarchy, I think it's impossible, in my experience, for the senior leadership to be able to do this on their own. So while everything, while that senior leadership team, whoever they are, need to behave in the right ways and need to set the right example, I think one of the things we experienced as a business was this need to develop our wider group of people leaders. So we have a group of people that are influencing others, managing others, and it's actually quite a big group. It's like 90 people. And I think if you don't invest in those people and develop them, there's no way you'll be able to do this on your own. And I think actually the role of the leader is just got much harder. It's probably as difficult as it's ever been for loads of different reasons. I think in a good way, there is much higher expectation around how people actually behave now in the working world, and that's good and that's great. But it's added to the people leader's role. There's more nuance and complexity. If we think about diversity, there is it's no longer good enough for a people leader to be able to say, well, I'm not going to talk about that in an interview. That's not good enough. There's been a changing attitude to work. We all know about hybrid versus in the office. So I think the leader's job has become much more difficult. So I think in terms of dealing with this, if an organization isn't developing that group of people, it doesn't stand a chance, and it needs to develop and support them so that they can identify and deal with these things when they see them.
Can I, Danny, if I may, can I just add to what Adam has just outlined about it being difficult to be a leader in the environment and the world that we live in. At one organisation that I worked at, I went on this fantastic course around having difficult conversations, and it was exceptional. Actually, I will name the organisation. It was BAE Systems that put me through this brilliant course around having difficult conversations as a leader or as a manager or as a director in the organisation. The right way to have a conversation with your team members, because we're all coming at this from a very positive light about seeing toxic leadership come down. It is challenging to be a leader, and there are times when you do have to have challenging conversations, but they can be had in the right way, and work through the right ways so that they don't show the traits of toxic leadership. The means equals the ends. The strange behaviours of it being about self, but it is about the team and having those conversations that are reflective and right for that individual, which then goes back to what Tony was saying around walking the floor, knowing your team, right, and knowing the people that you work with, and understanding their own personal boundaries so that you can have the right conversation at the right moment as well. Thank you.
Yeah. Can I just come in on a couple of follow-up points on that? I mean, I think the point about it being more difficult to be a leader these days. I mean, there's good and bad in this, isn't there? That and again, without being too stereotypical, I'm fairly sure that much of the younger workforce nowadays just would not tolerate some of the behaviours that maybe some of us felt we had to tolerate 30 years ago. The challenge is, though, that it's whether that non-tolerance exhibits itself in challenge and seeking to improve, or people just walking with their feet. Yeah, if people are walking with their feet, that's a that's an indicator for you, but it doesn't solve the problem, and it's not good economically. So just to kind of flag that I think people just will not tolerate some of the things that we had to. And then that point about difficult conversations, one of the phrases that we use in Sodexo is we talk about challenging with humility. I think that's an interesting concept in the context of a toxic leader, where perhaps humility is not one of the strong points, and even having that as an espoused behaviour, and looking for evidence of that, and looking for evidence of the positive rather than just the presence of the negative behaviour, gets you into discussions around about where are you finding this difficult, what is it about challenging with humility that you find difficult, and then helping people on that journey to try and exhibit those behaviours.
I think that's a really fantastic point there, Tony. And Adam, your point there of it's more difficult to be a leader today. I think there's also an element of it's quite difficult to be a follower as well, particularly a non-toxic follower. We can't always pin toxic behaviours on the leader itself, because it can come from the team upwards and actually generate a toxic leader. But for me, the first indication of toxic leadership that's quite easy and consistent to spot is walking into a team and immediately noticing that alpha type, that person that is the strong, confident, assertive aura. Now, there's definitely a place for that style of leadership. I believe there's a place for every style of leadership, but also every style could become toxic. It's when that assertiveness becomes overcritical, or that strength becomes overpowering. If we then look back at the previous points, I think it really revolves around the subject of highlighting the negativity of a team or overlooking a job well done, rather than that building that curiosity, that learning and development, and then moving forward.
Yeah, I agree with that. And going back to the point Libby made, actually, it's this stuff, it takes quite a long time to get right. But I think if you're not providing feedback to people, and you're not able to just have a conversation at a very early stage with someone and gently correct, or say, actually, you could have done that differently, you could have run that meeting differently, you were a bit over the top, you were a bit overly assertive, I think that it snowballs. And I think so often the issues that come across my desk as an HR director, it's got to the point where it's become a bigger issue to deal with. And the very first question I always ask people when they come to me, a people leader comes to me, is I just ask them, have you actually had a conversation about this? And still, quite often in my career, the answer has been no. So I think it's all about having those initial discussions and being brave enough to have them at an early stage. And it's great to hear Libby said, in terms of actually, sometimes that requires a bit of training, and that can be where training can be effective. And sorry, I just talked over Tony because Tony had raised your
oh,
hand.
No, you beat me to it. Don't worry, Adam. And yeah, I was just reflecting, actually. One of the things that I found as I was preparing for this is that in our worlds, those alpha male, if you want to call them that, can be seen as a success factor, and there is a difference, as you say, between a strong character and a one-trick pony, and I think that's important, particularly in our worlds where situational leadership and that diversity of approaches is valued. But the empowering thing for me in all of this is, if you are on the receiving end of this, is to turn it on its head and say this is about insecurity. And that, even just making that statement in your own mind fundamentally changes the power balance, doesn't it? It's the analogy of, the actor on stage who just imagines the crowd with no clothes on. It just changes the power dynamic. And I think that empowering nature to say, if you're seeing some of these behaviours, it's the exact opposite of what that person is intending it to be. And then that puts the power back to you, doesn't it? For you to do something about it, rather than waiting for somebody else to do something about it, because you can then tailor how you respond to that.
Tony, could I, if I may, just pick up on something you just said there? Primarily not to pick you up on this at all, but there are alpha females out there as well, and I have come across some. But just to say, in terms of, and it kind of looks at one of the questions that someone has asked in the chat as well. So there are times in individuals' lives when I've been in teams where there has been a toxic leader, And you as an individual are very, very strong, but you can see other members of your team who are not as strong, or not as in a fortunate position as to say, yes, that is about insecurity. And I think it's really super important to, where there is this toxicity and you're trying to work through it, how you can support your team members and how you can actually turn team members around. And I was in a super privileged position to do this with a colleague of mine who, I know this is quite a strong term, had been pretty much binned by the leadership. But I saw huge potential in this individual because I worked with them day by day and by their side. And it was a real privilege to see this individual at work, but somehow their capability was not seen by the senior leadership. And I think it's really important to work alongside your team members. And what I did with that individual was I had twice weekly meetings with them. I had a meeting on a Monday morning to say, what's your plan for this week? And then a meeting on later on in the week to say, how did your week go? How's it been this week? And interestingly, they were having a huge amount of personal problems at home, and that's why they didn't feel they could speak out, and I knew that they kind of needed shielded. So I worked with them, and eventually, after 18 months of working with that individual, they went on to be promoted within the organisation and do another fantastic job where they really were valued outside of a team which didn't have a toxic leader. Now, I'm not saying pat on the back for Libby here, but I think it is important to recognise that not everyone at that moment in their life, there might be some personal challenges as well as professional ones, which do not allow them to see the wood for the trees and see a toxic leader for what they are. So sometimes we need to be cool team members and look after our team and work with them. So just as a little hint and tip for others who might be struggling.
100%.
Yeah.
And I think, oh, sorry, Lynn, after you.
No, that's no problem. Absolutely, Libby, just building on your point there, I've certainly come across some toxic alpha females in my time, and that can be extremely damaging and difficult to navigate. And to your point that sometimes when a person is in the position of being led by a toxic leader, because of the conversations they're having with that leader, their confidence is eroded over a period of months. And actually their ability to see the wood for the trees, which I think was a phrase you just used, is severely impaired because of that. And absolutely having a safe space or someone to talk to about what that person is experiencing, I think is hugely valuable. And my advice to anyone in that situation is to make notes, gather evidence in terms of what you're experiencing and how it's making you feel on a day-to-day basis. And I think when you look back at those notes, it can be very telling. And when you express that to somebody else, you can see it for what it is. And they can support you through that. So it's not always as obvious as having to speak up in a moment. That impact of toxic leadership over a period of time can be incredibly damaging to individuals' confidence.
Hugely so, Lynn, thank you. What I think we can take away from this is that we're all talking about that proactive nature within the team, both as a follower, but also as a leader seeing toxicity within the team, just that proactive approach. And like you said, Lynn, not always attacking the situation head on isn't always the best way to do it in the moment. And I think that speaks volumes. Sometimes a cool, calm, but also a bit of a delayed response can be the best result that we're all looking for. But this really nicely segues us into the next question of, once we've identified these traits, what actions can we take to constructively address it? But furthermore, how do we prevent its reoccurrence in the future? And I just want to put a spin on this as well from one of the questions that we've received in the chat. What advice would you give to a contractor working within a team where it's the customer that's also displaying these toxic traits? And Tony, can you start us off, please?
Yeah, absolutely. This is something that we recognise. We've got a phrase, I'm sure other companies have it as well, about right client, right terms. And so not just any business for any cost, but actually it's got to be, it's also got to be the right contractual terms, but it's got to be somebody who fits with our values. It's got to be somebody who we trust. to look after our staff on their premises, for example, if we're providing services on their premises. And one of the helpful ways into this is to view this as a health and safety issue as much as a cultural issue. And if you think through the impact, the potential negative impact of this, as you're doing your risk assessments of areas, a key part of that is what's the environment like, what's the culture like, because that's going to have a direct impact on the mental health and well-being of either direct employees or, a contractor's employee or a subcontractor's employee somewhere. And being aware of that, it may not be entirely obvious at first, but just having measures in place to be aware of that, because then it becomes more serious. It becomes broader than just, oh, well, that's the way they are, we've got to live with it. If it has an impact on your employees' health, safety and well-being, then it's actually, it turns into something slightly more serious than that. And I think it then gives you as a, depending on which, on which side you are, but if you're a subcontractor working on a site somewhere, I think it gives you a different power balance again to have a conversation that says, excuse me, but I've got a duty of care here. For my people. Now, I get, I know this all ties down, and I can see the comment in the chat about people feeling able to talk and to raise these things. So, there's that 360-degree thing that we've talked about elsewhere. But if that all comes together, it's a very powerful tool for you to use as a contractor on different premises, as looking at it through a slightly different lens.
Tony, I could not agree more. And as Danny was asking this question, I was thinking about health and safety. And when I was working in the oil industry, and particularly out on rigs and in some nasty conditions, we used to have this saying called "stop the job," and it literally meant that. And it usually meant someone was about to get, seriously injured, or there was a potential fatality about to happen. Especially when you're on a drill floor, it's a really nasty place to work. And highly dangerous. But we then started to transfer stop the job from a rig environment to the office, and where we saw a safety moment or an issue coming up, like someone's about to trip over a cable because we'd run cables all around a room, we'd say stop the job just to stop that person in their tracks, and then it became a safety moment issue. And safety moments used to happen at the beginning of each of the meetings when I used to work in the oil industry. And they had a variety of things. They weren't just about, oh dear, the cementing's gone wrong on the casing on the rig this week. Actually, it became critical around things like names on CVs and unconscious bias when we're interviewing people, and all sorts of topics. I could not agree more, Tony. I think that is such a super way of putting it. This is a health and safety issue, because it is a safety issue for individuals' mental health, and it's a safety issue for the organisation. It's a safety issue that if you perpetuate toxic behaviour, is probably not going to have a commercial business in the future, or you're going to have one which is so depleted of excellent staff that you won't be able to function in a high-performant way. So, Tony, thank you for that. I thought that was awesome.
I'd just like to build on that. I think absolutely addressing toxic leadership early is required, because otherwise it spreads. And I've seen it spread, and I've seen behaviours impact organisations very, very quickly. And building what the others have talked about here in terms of the impact to individuals. I've spoken to individuals who've talked about the impact to them where they're driving into the office in the morning and they've thought about driving into the car in front of them, so they haven't had to come in and face some of the challenges for working for a particular leader. So I think we're all absolutely agreed. Let's not underestimate the impact this can have on individuals. It's incredibly serious, and it spreads into all aspects of individuals' lives.
Yeah, that's a really good point. I mean, a piece of research which resonated with me, I can't remember where it's from, but it kind of links to your point, Lynn, was, people respond far more strongly to bad stuff happening to them than good stuff, and they retain that far longer. So if you map that into the behaviors of a leader, you've got one leader in a function in the business behaving badly in a toxic way, you need exponentially far more people behaving in a really good way to sort of counterbalance that or remove that. So I think that really resonated with me, and I think is one of the reasons as well. I mean, I know I said earlier that you kind of need to develop your leadership group more broadly, but you also need a senior leadership team that has the ability just to recognize the time has come and we need to actually intervene. We need to remove someone. We need to just do that because the organization is watching. So I think, anyway, that was a point that I thought was interesting.
I find it really interesting, your approach to the question, thinking of it as a health and safety. For me, I saw it, but it's much more of a cultural question of, does the culture around it build that toxic leadership to prosper in the first place? And I think a really good way of preventing its occurrence in the future is instilling a just culture into your workplace. Not necessarily a blameless culture, but more looking at the process and saying, right, okay, this is our single point of failure. This is what has produced our toxic leader, whether that be workload or high risk, high reward, etc. And then it completely removes the finger pointing aspect of that blame culture. And it just allows somebody to feel comfortable within the team then to say, that's my mistake. This is how I do it differently. This is how I can do it better. And for me, it just installs a learning and development mentality or leadership style within that team. And then everybody buys into the fact that learning is cognizant of honest behavior. So all of these toxic traits that we were speaking about earlier of that narcissism and almost the deceit that comes with that is completely eradicated. So when new joiners enter your team, that any inkling of a toxic leadership quality is immediately stamped out. Because that culture is already firmly ingrained within the team and they can go from there. Any thoughts on that at all?
Danny, sorry, Tony, I think you were poised to go ahead there. Sorry. It is most definitely cultural, for certain. I would challenge about sort of just behaviours and sort of non-blame cultures. Nobody wants a blame culture at work. That is dreadful. And I'm not sure about a just culture either. I think an open culture where it's okay to fail. And because toxic leadership often points out and opens up the cracks of failure or homes into somebody's mistakes perhaps. And they're not mistakes. They're all learnings. Everything that we do at work is a learning. No one can know for sure what the right answer is. And especially in certainly the world I operate in now and will continue to operate in, of sort of fast-paced technology evolution and development, none of us know the answers, right? And I think, and I was listening to a Radio 4 program about women allowing their children to fail. And how they felt about that. It was sort of high performance, high pressure mums. And I just thought, wow, what pressure individuals seem to be under not to fail. In my job, certainly in the previous world, in the oil and gas sector, we were encouraged to get things wrong, to understand unstructured approaches to learning. And I think that culture of openness and being able to challenge ourselves, and that is so 360 from toxic leadership, of only getting things right, the means serve the ends or the ends serve the means, whatever it is, whatever the saying is. I think it's really, really important to completely open up our culture and our thinking, to challenge ourselves, to fail, to be good, to be great, to be not great, and then go again. So I actually think there is a stepwise transition in the way that we lead and the way that we think in the first place. So that we encourage those diverse teams, we create a set of values which is cognizant and omnipresent for everybody. So slight challenge there for you, Danny.
Yeah, if I come in on this one, if that's okay, yeah. I mean, this is something that I wrestle with all the time. I'm sure we do, because I'm not sure what the answer is, but in our industries, where there are very real consequences for failure, and often catastrophic and personal consequences for failure. It's how you strike that balance between, learning, allowing for that, moving on from that, but still recognise the significance and the severity of a failure, and how you do that in a way that makes sense for people. And just as we're talking, I mean, I think it's about, it's the full circle, isn't it? It's people will know if it's fair or not. Yeah, if it doesn't feel fair, you've probably got something wrong in your culture. You know, if you can be seen to be dealing with, you know, robustly and strongly with things that have gone wrong and should not have gone wrong, and still learn from that in a way that people feel is just, in a way that people feel is balanced, then it's a good indicator for you. But I've not got a magic bullet for it, but it's something that we wrestle with all the time about where you set your thresholds about, you know, acceptability or non-acceptability of failure. And just very quickly, one of the other things is, and I was listening to what you were saying, Danny, is that the unfortunate thing about culture is you've got to start from where you are. And, you know, part of this, I think, is about that honest self-assessment about where you are, both personally, you know, on the scale, and, you know, where your team is and where your organisation is, because that's where you've got to start from, isn't it? You know, so you move into that, but sometimes you've got to do some eradication. You know, if something is toxic, sometimes you've got to take some fairly radical action, because no amount of persuasion, no amount of effort is going to get you to where you want to be quickly enough going forward. And yeah, you know, just you know, I think there is that view there, but it's how far you've got to travel and how quickly you're willing to make that journey.
Completely.
Yeah, and I think.
Sorry, after you.
Sorry, Dan. Well, I'm going to sort of agree with Tony, really, but I also think that kind of just encapsulates why this can't be done through any set of you know, codes of conduct or policies or processes. All of that's important stuff and is a signal of a mature organization. But if you're not talking to people that are in leadership responsibility about this stuff all the time and sort of developing them, you're going to find it very, very difficult to get there. And I think there needs to be more open conversations with leaders saying, you didn't get that quite right, you could have done this slightly differently, and you can only get the right, you know, you can only get an open culture by doing that again and again, and eventually people will just begin to get more accustomed to it and not feel bad to be corrected or to be given feedback like that. So I think it's quite a long process that, you know, is more than just policies and processes.
Exactly that, Adam. And I really appreciate the challenge, Libby. And I think Tony much more eloquently described what I was trying to talk about when it comes down to that learning and development mentality. And one of the comments in the chat, I think, sums it up perfectly, which is people that see fail as that first attempt in learning. And that's what I'm talking about when we say, right, okay, this was our point of failure. Let's go back to where the policy and process let us down. Let's investigate it and let's re-attack it. Go again, because somewhere along the lines it didn't work. Now, in my world, I'm an air traffic controller by trade. So as Tony was talking about, failure has big consequences. It's all about being risk aware, but not risk adverse. Just understanding that a decision has an impact and it can have a real severe life impact. But what do we do about that? How do we incorporate that into our culture? And it almost goes back to that stop the job mentality of, right, let's stop, let's go back and let's reassess because something's not quite right. This sort of leads us down a little bit more on talking about the cultural and organizational aspect of this, because we've all agreed that this is much bigger than a single individual, one decision, and it's definitely not a quick fix. Culture displays longevity. Libby, can you start us off, please, with what role does organizational structures, policies, and systems play in enabling and mitigating these behaviors?
I think the response to that comes from the top, right? If we see behaviours from the very, very top of an organisation which reflect the values and the culture of our wider organisation, then it is easier to feel empowered as individuals to have the discussions that on all the topics that we have spoken about today on this really varied and exciting discussion. And sorry for my slow response, I was reading some of the questions that were coming through, and especially the last one from Oliver Brown around you know, that challenge and being able to have freedom of thought, which almost directly answers your question, I think. Every industry that I've ever worked in, just to go back to the previous point, has had, if you make a mistake, there would be catastrophic failure, almost certainly loss of life. But if we don't understand the curiosity of culture from the top to make those mistakes, we will never be able to mitigate against some of those massive risks, because we won't see them coming. And so I think everything starts from the top. Great leadership starts from the very top and cascades all the way through. And if we see those values being lived from the top, and I love Tony's comment around walking the carpet. I've worked in an organisation where the CEO of that company used to literally, when he could, and when he was in that particular location, would come and talk to individuals and would know their names. And it was a huge company. So he'd probably been briefed very carefully prior to doing so, but it made a massive difference. If you demonstrate great leadership and values and culture from the top, it will cascade and be pervasive through your organisation. If you isolate yourself in a glass box, in a glass room, in a CEO special location, in a special place, which divides you from the rest of your organisation, you will never proliferate your ideals and the values of that organisation. So for me, always comes from the top. I hope that answers the question. Sorry, I was half reading the other questions in the box, so I hope I caught that question correctly. If I've said it completely wrong, I'm really sorry.
No, Libby, it was perfect. Thank you very much. I'm going to open it up to the floor as well. Any thoughts?
Well, I think an interesting thing that follows on from what Libby was saying, which, you kind of get as you need to think about who's actually going to lead in your organization. So we are a business of we have lots of analysts, and and I think one of the things that we've thought about is that not everyone wants to be a leader or should be a leader. So I think you have to be thoughtful about your organizational structure. And I've seen in the past quite often organizations just promote people into leadership roles, and it's quite often not the right thing to do. So even something as simple as thinking about career pathing in an organization is important. So yeah, that's another point on that.
I think it's a balance, isn't it? If this is about policies and procedures and structures, I mean, in some ways they should be a hygiene factor in the modern age, I suppose would be the first thing to say, but and I'm sure we all recognise this. We've got a saying that a good leader can make a bad plan work really well. A bad leader can ruin the best plans in the world. So you can have the best structures, you can have the best stuff up on the wall, you can have world-class whistleblowing procedures, skip interviews, etc. But if you've not got the right people doing them, and you've not got the right people in there, it's just going to go around in a vacuum. Or worse, it will be inauthentic, and that's worse in some ways. So just reflecting on that. So it's not either or, it's both. But if you've got to start from somewhere, just to absolutely echo the point, it's people. Set the tone.
I think for me as well, creating a psychologically safe environment. So one of the questions in the chat was, how can I ensure that I don't become a toxic leader and people feel comfortable to challenge? I think setting the scene, telling people, actively disagree if you disagree with me, welcoming others' points of view, and being very receptive to challenge in a public forum is really useful, and also ensuring that you ask for feedback. And as a leader yourself, we've talked about role modeling here, just ensuring that you're checking yourself, but you're also opening yourself up to conversations and not being too defensive when people express different points of view, because you welcome that challenge and you welcome that variety of perspective around the table. And I think setting the scene with your team and saying, I haven't got all the answers here, that's where I'm looking for your broad perspectives on this, is really useful in encouraging people to feel safe to challenge, but also sometimes sharing your own failings and weaknesses, being vulnerable enough to say, I didn't quite get that right last week. You know, I'm not perfect, I'm learning, I'm constantly learning and evolving, and that was something that I recognise I didn't get right, because I think it encourages others then to be much more open about some of the struggles they may have and the risks they may be facing.
So I'm just going to jump in there. I was smiling as you were talking there, Lynn. I was thinking about the old adage that, you know, if you worry about being a psychopath, you probably aren't one. So, you know, and this, you know, the very fact that people are willing to ask the question about themselves and about be self-reflective is, you know, 75% of the battle, isn't it? You're pushing an open door, and maybe that's one of the tests, you know, a nice soft test in your organisation is to see how people react to that question. They give you a useful insight.
Brilliant. Thank you very much, everybody. I think for me, there's almost like a bottom-up approach here as well. Of we can talk about the levels of leadership, like high management, etc. But that middle management and low management really does have an effect as well. Of peer-to-peer leadership is something that we talk about quite a lot in my world, of holding each other accountable. Not necessarily that followership, but being that individual to step out and say, actually, I don't agree with what's going on here. And that structure there of being the individual amongst the sheep, essentially, of just saying, right, okay, this is what we should really be doing, and having your peers follow you in that direction. It really does get rid of that sort of that mindset of constantly looking up, but also looking side to side, because we also lead each other and we don't even realize we're doing it half the time. Unfortunately, we're going to have to wrap up because we're coming to the end of our time now, but it's been really insightful. Thank you very much. I think it's safe to say that the panel today has highlighted the damaging effects of toxic leadership on both individuals and the organisations alike. I really enjoyed the conversation that we had earlier about mental health and how it really does impact key individuals. Moving forward, let's prioritise the more proactive measures to identify and rectify toxic leadership's influence in the workplace. By fostering a culture of transparency, accountability and empathy, we can really cultivate a healthy work environment where we can all thrive. A massive thank you to everybody today for taking your time to share your brilliant insights and your lived experiences. I've learned so much. I really appreciate it. Thank you. But also thank you to everybody who took the time to join us today. Your questions have been fantastic, and thank you so much for getting involved with the chat. Please, everybody, enjoy the rest of your day, and I look forward to seeing you all soon. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thanks, everyone.
Thanks all.
Thanks, Danny.
Bye.